The French and Indian War is often cited as a prelude to the American Revolution, and I'd like to share with you some materials from the Library of Congress's collections that reveal how the colonists' experience of that conflict began shaping and sharpening a uniquely American identity. My name is Patrick Hastings, and I work in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division. Throughout the 18th century, the British and the French competed for North American lands as well as for the allegiance of indigenous peoples. While the French considered the Allegheny Mountains to be the natural boundary of British territory, the British believed that their colonies extended westward, even to the Pacific Ocean. This claim was bolstered during a conference held in 1744 between colonial governors and the leaders of the Iroquois League. Benjamin Franklin printed the treaty that emerged from this 2-week-long conference. This treaty established an Iroquois alliance with the British against the French and ceded Iroquois lands on the colony's western frontiers, formally recognizing the king's rights to all the land that are or shall be, by His Majesty's appointment, in the colony of Virginia. Soon thereafter, the Ohio Company of Virginia was established to survey and eventually settle and cultivate the fertile lands along the Ohio River. At the beginning of 1753, however, the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, learned that the French had built 3 new forts in present-day western Pennsylvania, with preparations underway to construct a 4th fort at the forks of the Ohio in present-day Pittsburgh. Dinwiddie wrote a stern letter to the French in the name of King George II, expressing concern and surprise that they are erecting fortresses and making settlements within His Majesty's dominions, and demanding the peaceable departure of the French from these lands. Governor Dinwiddie entrusted 21-year-old George Washington to deliver this letter to the French commander. Washington was an inexperienced soldier, but he had a good reputation as a surveyor of lands. Plus, at 6 feet tall and with hands so large he had to order custom-made gloves, Washington was a physical specimen with the courage and grit required to survive a long trip through the wilderness in the dead of winter. The ambitious young Washington was also eager to make a name for himself. He quickly assembled a team of 6 other men and set out from Williamsburg, Virginia, on horseback for a 500-mile expedition that would last 77 days in the snowy terrain of the Allegheny Mountains. In the personal journal Washington wrote while on the expedition, he recounted the many obstacles and complications this expedition encountered. It rained or snowed nearly every day for a month and a half. Their horses became so exhausted that the men had to dismount and carry their packs on foot. They got ambushed and shot at by French allies in the woods, and Washington fell into the frigid waters of the icy Allegheny River. When he finally met the French commander, Washington delivered Dinwiddie's letter demanding that the French forces vacate the Ohio region. The French commander wrote a polite letter that responded to this command simply, "I do not think myself obliged to obey it." When Washington returned to Williamsburg, he delivered this letter to Dinwiddie and gave details of the French military positions. Eager for more information, Governor Dinwiddie asked Washington to spend that night preparing his personal journal of the expedition into a report to be delivered the next day. As Washington writes with great humility in his prefatory note, "I think I can do no less than apologize in some measure for the numberless imperfections of his writing." He goes on to say that he had no idea that it ever would be published or even have more than a cursory reading till I was informed that it was already in the press. His journal was distributed up and down the American colonies and was even reprinted as a pamphlet in London, where it was read and discussed by the British political elite, giving young Major Washington renown across the empire. Ultimately, Washington's journal was influential in the decision to use British military force to assert territorial claims in the Ohio. The colonial soldiers who fought to secure these territories during the French and Indian War, however, were not treated fairly by the British Empire. When they enlisted, they were promised land in Ohio, but as this broadside letter from an American soldier to the King of Britain makes clear, after 9 years' hard service, the recompense they thought they had a right to claim has been refused to them. This broadside also notes that the British Army's regular officers, but not the colonial soldiers, had already received land as a reward for their service. The printing and distribution of this broadside suggests that the colonists were realizing that Britain treated them as second-class citizens. Likewise, George Washington was angry with the empire for not giving him the rank he deserved for his leadership and service during the war. In fact, he was demoted beneath officers commissioned by the crown simply because he was an American. Washington seethed over this offense for the next 2 decades. The resentment he and others felt toward Britain in the aftermath of the French and Indian War primed a scrappy American pride and patriotism. But let's return to the 1744 treaty that Benjamin Franklin printed. At the close of that conference, an Iroquois leader named Kanasatego delivered a speech that Franklin reproduced in the printed text. Kanasatego anticipated the encroachment of the French and offered advice to the American colonies. "We heartily recommend union and a good agreement between you, our brethren. Never disagree, but preserve a strict friendship for one another, and thereby you will become the stronger. Our wise forefathers established union and amity between the 5 nations. This has made us formidable. By your observing the same methods our wise forefathers have taken, you will acquire fresh strength and power." At the outset of the French and Indian War, Benjamin Franklin channeled Kanasatego's advice when he printed his iconic "Join or Die" woodcut, presenting the separate colonies with a new vision of a unified American identity. Out of the French and Indian War, and in these printed texts, the idea and spirit of the United States of America was born.